So my name's Curtis Wilcox. I'm a licensed clinical social worker with Blomquist Hale. Quick background on me, I have been a clinician for about 7 years now. I worked in inpatient and outpatient mental health settings. I have experience working with individuals with developmental disabilities as well as mental health disorders. And currently at Blomquist Hale, I'm a clinical trainer, so I train our therapists on different models and strategies for implementing therapy, as well as a crisis therapist. When they call and need somebody on site for a critical incident, I help in responding to those. This isn't going to reach. I will have to be a little closer. Okay, well, looks like I will just have to be up here. So real quick, just to make sure everyone's aware of their benefits. With Blomquist Hale, you have access to therapy. It's free to you. You don't have to go through insurance or anything like that. We're here to help with any life challenge. You don't have to have some critical incident in your life for it to be justified to go to therapy. Literally anything that you're struggling with, if you feel like it'd be helpful, you're welcome to schedule with us. We offer phone and video counseling, and of course, in person as well. I think for up here, if you're wanting to see somebody in person, we can get that coordinated for you. We have a 24/7 crisis line as well. If you call our main number, even on the weekends, you'll get a hold of somebody and you can speak to an on-call therapist if you're going through a crisis. So I want to start with just making sure we're all on the same page in terms of what stress and anxiety and even trauma are, because I think that's really helpful. Stress and anxiety, they can be kind of interchangeable. Sometimes we say we're anxious and we're stressed. This is a nice framework. This is how I like to view it. Stress is considered more of that normal kind of pressure and just having things that we have to do. There's an adaptive function to having stress in our lives. Oftentimes, it motivates us. It can be that thing that helps us to feel like, oh, I got to get this done. And then we take action and get things done. You could say that this is true for any emotion, right? Anger, sadness, stress. It all has that ability. I mean, we have emotions so that we can get our needs met. So when we're attuned to that and we're tapped into that, it has an adaptive function. You could compare that to anxiety, and anxiety is more of a mental health disorder. It's more of something that in therapy we're going to try to treat, which means reduce or as much as we can get rid of. So you can see here there are several different anxiety disorders. These are all found in our diagnostic manual. You could technically include obsessive compulsive disorder in there because it is so closely linked to anxiety disorders, but anxiety is something we treat. It's a clinical mental health disorder. Whereas stress, we would say, is more normal, and it's just something to be managed. I should also say, if you have any questions, if I'm bringing up something and you want to know more about it, please just let me know. Happy to answer. I'll try to leave some time for questions as well at the end. So I want to add to this discussion, that's stuff I'm bringing up, trauma, because it is totally different in a lot of ways than stress and anxiety. You can see there's 2 points here, right? When we have trauma, it means we're talking about an event that occurred in which you either had such an extreme, overwhelming emotional experience that it felt unmanageable, and or the individual, meaning yourself, had a situation where there was this perceived threat to either your life or safety, your bodily integrity, or your sanity. So it could be either or both of those, but it leads to a traumatic experience. Now, I said subjective, and I underline at the bottom there, trauma is a relative experience. We can have two people go through the same traumatic event, and one gets back and is okay, and the other develops PTSD. And there's a lot of vulnerability factors associated with that, but some of it is unpredictable. It can just be a matter of where you're at in life, what's going on in your life, and it just leads to that change in your brain chemistry. So I can say when we talk about trauma is not necessarily PTSD, right? Trauma is that distressing experience, like I said, when those two elements are in place. Either it's emotionally overwhelming or you have that perceived threat to your life or well-being. So any situation that we experience like that is going to lead to psychological distress. That is normal. Our bodies are set up, our brains are set up to keep us safe. We have that fight, flight, freeze mode for a reason. But it leads to us experiencing psychological distress. So I put this up as a trauma timeline, trying to show that whenever we go through a traumatic experience, it is normal and appropriate for us to have that period or window of psychological distress. And what they say is it's about 3 days. I mean, it can depend on how intense the experience was. And when you complicate it with like grief and loss and other things that could happen during a traumatic situation, there may be more time involved with recovery. But in that time period, about 3 days after the event, our brains are really set up to resolve that, to get back into feeling regulated and okay. After 3 days, if we are experiencing PTSD symptoms, right? Invasive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, physiological reactions to triggering situations, then it would be considered an acute stress disorder, which can sometimes, not always, but sometimes is a precursor to post-traumatic stress disorder. After 1 month of having those symptoms, then it becomes post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I should also clarify that there are plenty of times when you may have that initial psychological distress after an incident, and then you might feel okay, and then a month, 2 months, 3 months down the road, something can shift and you can start having PTSD symptoms. So the acute stress disorder is not always a precursor to post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I bring that up because at any point, any of us can be involved in a traumatic situation. It's really, really good to know that at any point, you may be experiencing these symptoms. Again, our bodies want to get back to a sense of normalcy. And they may, but it's good to be aware that when you're having acute stress disorder symptoms or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, therapy can help. We've got some very specific techniques and approaches that make it so that those symptoms become manageable and they get reduced. When it comes to whether it's anxiety or trauma, it's good to be aware that when you're having those symptoms, avoidance can be very problematic. And yet it's something that we tend to do. On the anxiety side, it's because anxiety is so closely linked to problem solving, right? When we problem solve, when we are trying to figure something out, our minds are set up to have automatic thoughts that make us more efficient and make it quicker and easier for us to come up with solutions. We see a problem, automatic thoughts start occurring, we start picking and choosing what's important, and we're able to lay it out. It makes us very good at solving problems. But it can have a negative effect when we are trying to solve problems that are emotionally overwhelming and we don't know how to regulate our mood, or when we get stuck on trying to solve unsolvable problems. The best example of that is death. When we have somebody close to us that we know who passes away, oftentimes our mind jumps to trying to problem solve it. And we see that with thinking in terms of, if only I would have been there, if I would have done more, if I would have done this, right? That's our minds trying to solve their death. The problem is, death isn't a solvable thing. You can't resolve that. So it ends up feeding into this anxiety. When we avoid, it means that we actually reinforce the anxiety, because avoidance means that we believe in the thoughts that are causing us to feel anxious. We start avoiding, saying, oh no, I can't do that, or oh, that's not going to be manageable. Same is true for trauma. Avoidance of trying to address trauma reinforces trauma. And what we find is that when you avoid treatment of trauma, those emotional triggers that you experience end up becoming even more triggering, right? It's kind of like you see or hear or feel or touch, smell, the trigger hits you, and it becomes almost unmanageable. So I just want to reinforce, whether you're dealing with anxiety or trauma, it's important to get it addressed. Now the good news, again, like I was referring to earlier, is our mind, our brains want to get back to a sense of normalcy. They want to get back to that feeling of homeostasis, where things are balanced and okay. Call it neuroplasticity, right? Our brain's ability to change and restructure. And this happens. And it can happen on a normal, just not seeing a therapist basis. But there are times where it doesn't happen. And that's when seeing a therapist can help. I won't bog you down with the, neuro terminology here. This middle part, when we're talking about the amygdala, all I wanted to highlight was the fact that we have two types of memory. We have that memory where if somebody asked you, what was your favorite vacation? Or what do you love about Christmas, or, the holiday season? You can recall events and stories, and you can say what happened and be able to relay that kind of narrative. But there's a second type of memory, and it's our emotional memory. And that's not in our conscious awareness. Sometimes it's linked to that other memory, but oftentimes it's not. And this is where somebody can be going to their local grocery store. They are just going down an aisle they've been to hundreds of times. And all of a sudden, they hear something, smell something, taste something, feel something, and it triggers that emotional memory. And they start having a panic attack, and they don't know why. They feel like they're going to die. They feel like their stress level is so overwhelming that they can't manage things. They become reactive and panicked. And it's because the emotional memory has been triggered. And this is heavily tied to trauma when we have trauma in our lives. Oftentimes it's stored in those memory systems attached to the emotional memory. So the last thing is just understanding that the vagus nerve, we've got this really cool research up at the U of U. They've been doing a lot of research behind this, but multiple universities. They can now see that the vagus nerve is a strong part of how we can manage stress. The vagus nerve is found in the brain, and it's attached to our central nervous system. Strong vagal tone leads to stronger ability to manage stress. And I think we've seen it in two ways. The first is strong vagal tone leads to a higher threshold, meaning it takes more stress in order for us to get into fight, flight, freeze mode or become overwhelmed. And the other is in our ability to calm down from stress. That when we engage in our coping skills and other ways that we try to manage stress, we find it's easier to calm down from that. So increasing the vagal tone is a pretty important piece, which of course we'll talk about. Before I jump to this next piece, any questions so far about any of that? Okay. So for the rest of this presentation, what I'm going to be talking about are specific tools and skills that we can develop that will help us both in that immediate situation when we're in a traumatic, stressful situation, as well as talking about what we can do following an event like that. So the first skill, as you can see, is mindfulness. Now, if you were to Google search mindfulness, you'd probably find all sorts of ideas and descriptions. They might describe it as just being meditation. But mindfulness is actually pretty simple, really, when you break it down. When we talk about mindfulness, it's just simply having skills and abilities that help you focus on your present situation and being able to cast out judgment of that situation. Or another way to say that is being able to accept the situation you're in. Now that has several benefits. The first one that I'm going to link to goes back to the vagus nerve. Mindfulness has been found to increase vagal tone. So that means people who actively engage in mindfulness practice have increased vagal tone. And like I said before, increased vagal tone increases our capacity to manage stress in our lives. The other benefit, of course, of mindfulness is that when you practice and implement these exercises, you're increasing your mind's ability to focus when you want it to. That's going to help you so that if you've got stuff at home that's on your mind and you're trying to focus at work, you can use mindfulness to be focused, be engaged, and not get so caught up on what's going on at home. Or vice versa, right? You've got work stress, but you're trying to be at home. Be present for your family or whatever you're doing at home. Mindfulness will help you be focused on that present moment and be able to fully engage in it. Now, there's two types of mindfulness exercises, I guess categories of mindfulness. We call them formal and informal mindfulness. Formal mindfulness is when you are taking the time to sit down and do a mindfulness exercise. Your whole focus is on doing that exercise. Informal mindfulness is when you are doing other activities, but you're doing them mindfully. You're incorporating that skill set that you can develop in whatever you're doing and being fully focused on that and mindfully aware of it. When we talk about crisis incidents and traumatic incidents, the informal mindfulness is what's applicable. Because if you're in a critical incident, if you've been training and you've worked on having that mindfulness skill, it means you're going to be more aware and present to the crisis situation. You're going to be able to be aware of what's going on. You're going to be able to focus on what's needed. And that overwhelming stress will feel more manageable. Whereas formal mindfulness, of course, is more of actually sitting down and doing a meditation or sensory engagement where you're enjoying something you can see, smell, taste, whatever sensory you want to use. Mindfulness, one last point about it, is like going to the gym. We find that if you practice it on a regular basis, you have that increased capacity to be focused and to utilize it when you need to. If you're not practicing it regularly, it's going to be harder to see that benefit and to be able to focus when you need to. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Just know that, again, we see that benefit come in both the gray and white matter, two different types of neurons we see in the brain. But this is just a list, and I'm happy to send this by email, this PowerPoint. But this is just a list of things that can help with that neuroplasticity, that ability to feel like your brain is being well managed, and of course, mindfulness and your diet is included in that. The dialectical behavioral therapy, and I give you this terminology so that if you do ever go see a therapist, you're equipped to say, I saw a presentation from Curtis, he talked about dialectical behavioral therapy or DBT, sounded interesting, I wanted to pursue that, and the therapist will know what you're talking about. So dialectical behavioral therapy, it's a whole model of therapy, but what we're going to be focused on are these 4 core skills that are taught within the model. So again, they teach mindfulness skills. We're going to talk about 1 or 2 today. They teach distress tolerance skills, which are skills that help you get through a distressing situation. They teach emotion regulation skills, and those are skills you use to calm down when you're having a high mood state or when you're depressed to get back to feeling normal. They also teach interpersonal effectiveness skills, which is how do you effectively manage different types of relationships, especially those that are not great. How can you manage those effectively? But obviously, we're going to be focused on the first 3 for this presentation. Down at the bottom, there's that link. If you type in dbt.tools, it's a great website. It shows each of these skills and the different tools that are used for each of these. Very easy to navigate and can point you to those different skills. So this is a mindfulness concept. It's called Finding the Wise Mind, and it's this idea that when we're tapped into both our logical way of thinking and our emotions, we can make the best decision for ourselves. Again, this goes back to what I said earlier. Emotions can be effective and a helpful thing for us because when we develop emotional intelligence, we can have a better ability to notice what am I feeling, and then we can link that towards what need is not being met right now. What do I need to do to get my needs met? So this applies in that if we're too focused on the logical way of thinking, if we're too focused on thinking things logically and we're not tapped into our emotions, we may be making choices that don't address our needs, that aren't incorporating that emotional part. And the same can be true of the emotional mind. Sorry. The same can be true of the emotional mind. If we're too on the side of the emotional mind, we're more likely to be reactive, saying whatever comes to our mind, super emotional, but we're not thinking on that logical side. So the balance, finding the middle ground for both, is going to help us make the best choices. When I think about how this applies to managing stress, if we can find and practice this skill, it makes it so that when we're dealing with these stressful situations, we can take a moment and say, how am I doing, right? Am I too far on this emotional side? Am I too far on the reactive side? Can I get back to that middle ground? And then proceed with making a decision. This is a distress tolerance skill. It's called STOP. It's meant for being able to, when you're feeling overwhelmed, know how to just stop make sure that you know how to manage the situation, and that whatever action or choice you make going forward, it is best aligned with your values and what you want to do. Because again, we tend to, the more emotionally overwhelmed we get, the more we tend to be reactive and just take action regardless of the outcomes, and we're not thinking of outcomes. So this skill can be really helpful, especially when you practice it, to make sure you're taking time to be in touch with what you really want and your outcome. You're thinking of outcomes. This is another great distress tolerance skill. It's called TIP. Starting with the temperature, you want to use cold, usually ice or ice water. They actually do this in the hospital, in the ER system. If somebody is in a panicky state or they can't, get them to calm down, they will dunk their head in ice water. And what it does, I know that might sound cruel, but what they're effectively doing is they're dropping their heart rate significantly and calming their body down. There's two types of nervous system. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. It's like an on and off switch. So when we're in sympathetic nervous system, we're in fight, flight, freeze mode, we're reactive, we're panicky. Dunking your head in cold water or in just ice is like a quick way to shift that sympathetic nervous system off and go into parasympathetic nervous system, which is where we're calm. I would hope everyone here is in parasympathetic nervous system. It's where we're feeling okay. So that cold water, and again, it's extreme temperature cold, can help you have that quick shift. So if you're feeling calm and maybe a little stressed, I don't think that tool will help you at all. But when you're really overwhelmed, that can be a quick way to just kick that shift in. Intense aerobic exercise is good. The key here is, I've got another slide coming up on it. It's the next one. But the key here is being able to do something that's extremely intense for a short duration of time. So sprinting for a block, doing as many push-ups as you can in a minute, stuff like that. You want to do something that is super intense, and of course, the more muscles you engage, the better, but for a short period. And that has a calming effect on our bodies as well. Paced breathing is another good one. This is where you are controlling your breathing. You hold it for a period of time. My recommendation for anybody is when you're using paced breathing, the first thing you want to see is how long to hold your breath before your heart rate calms down. So the trick to doing it is finding your pulse. There it is. Finding your pulse, taking a deep breath in, holding it for about 8 to 9 seconds, and then slowly breathing it out. You should, during that time, feel your heart rate slow down. For some people, it may take more time. And so if you don't feel your heart rate slow down, then you'll want to try again and hold your breath for a little bit longer, maybe 10 seconds. But the recommendation is not to go over 12 seconds. So try to find what works for you, but for paced breathing, that would be my recommendation. Once you know typically how long it takes for your heart rate to slow down, you can then know that you want to hold your breath for that amount of time. That's a quick, easy exercise. It's something you can do at work, when you're feeling overwhelmed, or at home. Take a moment to hold your breath that long. It's not going to fix the things that are stressing you out, but it can help your body calm down. When we talk about paired muscle relaxation, it's just an exercise that you can take a moment to do. The trick to it is you kind of focus and isolate different groups of muscles throughout your body, and you go from flexing them intensely for about 8 to 10 seconds, and then relaxing them. So you may start with your feet, flex your feet for 10 seconds, hold it, and then relax them. And then maybe you go up to your calves, flex your calves for 10 seconds, and then relax them. All the way up to your face. The trick to that is being able to notice what it feels like when your muscles are intense versus when your muscles are relaxed. So these are some considerations of when to do the intense exercises. I won't go through all of them, but I think the key and important part here is just knowing that when you're in a high emotional state, it's an easy tool to use that will calm your body down. This is another DBT tool. It's called Improve. It's an acronym. Again, I won't go through everything here. A couple things I'll point out is when we talk about imagery exercises, we're talking about closing your eyes and drawing up an image that's relaxing to you. Now, there's some really important things. It's not like you can just drop an image of yourself at the beach or something. There are things that really help with this, one of which is that ability to engage with your senses in the image. So you can think to yourself, as you're drawing up that image that's relaxing, what would I see? You know, what do I see in this image? What do I hear in this image? What do I feel? The other thing that's important is being able to have a safe space image, meaning you want it to be a safe thing. So if you are drawing up an image, but there's negative emotions attached to that image, you either want to try to eliminate whatever is causing that negative emotion, or just find a different image altogether. I'll point out with prayer as well, that can be praying to a higher power, that can be meditation, that can be going out and connecting with nature. It can be contemplation, and if you do contemplation, my recommendation is contemplate the things you're grateful for. Make that a gratitude exercise. The rest I feel like are fairly self-explanatory, but of course if you have questions you can always ask. I'm happy to answer. When it comes to acceptance and commitment therapy, this is another tool we utilize. This is one that is really good for after you've been in a distressing event, after you've been in that traumatic situation. So the first tool with acceptance and commitment therapy is called cognitive diffusion. Now, cognitive diffusion is implementing these exercises that help you to distance yourself from unhelpful automatic thoughts. So we talked about how automatic thoughts are useful for problem solving, but they can become a problem at any point, can just increase your stress levels. When you practice cognitive diffusion, what you essentially do is you help yourself to diffuse from the thought, which means you're able to see it and change that relationship to where it's not like this truth in your mind. It's just this mental event. It just happens. And so what that looks like is you have a distressing thought, and instead of being like, oh my gosh, that's so true. Oh, I'm so worried about this. You have that ability to say, oh, there's that thought, and then you move on with your day. So it increases that ability. I've included a link here. It's a YouTube video of an exercise, one of many exercises that help with cognitive diffusion. But it's an imagery exercise that I think is a really helpful tool. Similar to mindfulness, cognitive diffusion is something that works best when you practice it and try to build that skill. The other thing that's important is value-directed living. So we know that when our actions don't align with our values, or we just aren't taking any action towards a value or something that's important to us, it creates a space where anxiety and depression can creep into our lives. So when we take the time to check in and see if our actions are aligned with our values, we can help reduce anxiety and depression. Now, relating this to a stressful or traumatic incident, again, we're talking about after we've been in an incident. There may be that 3-day period where you're like, I don't want to talk to people, I want to be by myself, I need time for myself, and that's fine. It may be even a little bit longer than that. But at some point, you usually do want to get back to connecting with people, to taking care of things that are important to you. So when you've had a traumatic incident and you don't go back to your values, you distance yourself from them, what tends to happen is you allow more depression, more anxiety to creep into your life. And all of a sudden, that traumatic situation, rather than creating resiliency, you're now creating more vulnerability in your life. So if we can go back to what's important to us and take action for those values, we can reduce that. Let's talk a little bit about resiliency. Try to make this quick. I wanted to point out resiliency because anytime we've had a negative event, a traumatic situation, our mind, even in an attempt to solve some problems, can start getting into some negative ways of thinking that lead to us being stuck in this victim mentality where we don't feel like we have power. We don't feel like we can do anything anymore. Resiliency, as you can see by this definition, is that ability to bounce back after a negative event. But by bouncing back, we don't mean going right back to where you were before the event. Oftentimes, that's never going to be the case. But bouncing back means adapting to and overcoming whatever trials may happen after an event. This is just 10 ways to build resiliency. These are recommendations. Obviously, each of these are going to look different for each of us. You could take any one of those and realize that it's going to be vastly different depending on where we're at in life and what we want to see different. But if we can work on building resiliency, we're going to feel like we have more ability to adapt. And again, there's that victim mindset that we can get stuck in, feeling like we're victims. But then there's the survivor mindset that we can find, where we redirect our attention towards the things that are in our control, rather than getting stuck in the things that aren't in our control. And we can focus and take action and move forward, addressing the things that are in our control. And that's what resiliency is about. I wanted to also connect resiliency to hope. I think it can be really powerful when you realize the relationship between hope and resiliency, because they kind of feed into each other. What I mean by this is when you have a sense of hope, meaning believing that things can get better regardless of where you're at in life, when you have that ability to have hope, it feeds into resiliency because you can overcome things. You can feel like you can take action to overcome that, no matter what's happened to you in your life. But then as you overcome, as you are resilient, it increases your hope because you start having more experiences that reinforce that belief that things can be better. Talk about resiliency in action really quick. These are 3 things that you can focus on in almost like a task way to also be implementing resiliency, right? So actively confront the adversity. And again, I would attach to that focusing on what you can control, what is in your control, and not getting bogged down by stuff that's out of your control. Orienting yourself towards the positive future outcomes, that attaches to hope. The other thing about that is we know from research that when we can get into that headspace of thinking positively, being optimistic, we tend to have a better mood, of course, but we also tend to shift more naturally into that survivor mindset rather than getting stuck in the victim mindset. And then being able to engage in our efforts to cope, that goes into everything we've been talking about. When you have skills and abilities that help you get through those situations, it helps you to overcome them. And of course, it makes the situations and what you have to struggle with more manageable. I'm not going to go through this. I've just included this to say that there are times when medication may be needed. I tend to be somebody that likes to focus on doing therapy and not trying to, introduce chemicals into your body unless it's necessary. But there may be a time where it helps. So I've included this with some information about general medications for anxiety. I've also included this to, provide, this isn't a fully exhaustive coping skills list. You could Google search any of these and find a variety of tools, but it is just a nice little list of things that you can do that we didn't even talk about today. I've also got this book recommendation list. These are some of many, many books that are really good when it comes to talking about reducing anxiety and managing stress. Depending on who I'm working with in therapy, I usually have even more of these or more workbook-oriented readings that I would recommend. But these are nice self-help books, things that are nice and easy to read, not heavy text books that aren't fun to read. And that's it. Does anyone have any questions or disagreements? Any concerns about what I brought up? My thoughts are this was meant to be, I hope there's some skills that you've gained from this, but it's kind of just an introductory because if you think about therapy, we've got multiple sessions to cover and talk about tools that may be specific for you and beneficial for you. So I would just encourage anybody, if you're struggling in this moment or any moments in the future, and you feel like it'd be helpful to talk to a therapist, don't hesitate to call. Because we've got a lot of great tools, stuff I didn't even cover, that can help people regardless of what they're going through.
Are there limits to how many sessions you can have?
It's a great question. So with a lot of EAPs, let me start with this. In therapy, there's 3 ways that we determine how or when therapy should end, okay? Session limits, where we just say from the get-go, people get this many sessions, and that's it. Therapist judgment, where we just say it's up to the therapist, right? When the therapist says, I think you're okay, we end therapy. And the last one is what we say client outcomes, meaning when we see somebody reach their goals and get the outcomes we want to see, we say we're good, right? We can end therapy. So most EAPs focus on session limits. They say you only get this many sessions, and it's usually like 3 to 4. And I honestly would never work for an agency that limited me that way. I would feel terrible if I was with somebody and we were doing good things, but I had to say, sorry, can't help you anymore because we're at session limits. So with Blomquist Hale, it's a little bit about therapist judgment in the early part because there are times when somebody has such a severe mental health disorder that we need to refer them to somebody that can do more intensive therapy or more long-term therapy. But the majority of the time, 85 to 90% of the time, in fact, the methods we use can work. And in that case, we focus on client outcomes. So that's my long way of answering you and saying, we don't have session limits. We focus on setting up goals, working towards those goals, making sure that you feel like you're making progress, and we can work with you for a variety of sessions. Always with that ability to say, if it's not working, or things shift and you need a more long-term therapist, we'll get you connected with one. Does that help? Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions?
What would you suggest? I have a brother and a son who suffer from severe anxiety and depression. What can we do to help them when they're feeling super anxious?
Yeah. Well, it's always tricky, right? So one of the things that makes that really hard on knowing how to support somebody, especially with anxiety, they say this a lot in the mental health world, but where there's anxiety, oftentimes depression is just around the corner.
Right.
And so we see that relationship between anxiety and depression. So if you've worked with somebody who's struggling with depression, you know that oftentimes they have a hard time finding motivation to get things done. When we do therapy, like, we see it really hard. We can teach coping skills, but if they're in depression, it can make it really hard to use those tools. So what I would recommend is having an honest discussion with them about how can I support you, right? Being able to try to figure out, what does support look like for that person? Is that a motivating force? Is that ability to go and say, okay, time to get out of bed, here we go, get you in the shower? Because that's a really important step, is being able to have routines in your life. When you have routines in your life, it simplifies a lot of areas where anxiety and depression can become a problem. If you just, okay, step 1, get in the shower in the morning. Step 2, have breakfast. So having a linear pattern you can follow helps with that. But as far as supporting somebody, you can see if it's being a motivating force, if it's helping them with recommendations for coping skills, because if they're super stressed or depressed, they may have a hard time recalling even what to do. So you might just sit down and say, let's make a nice exhaustive list of things that help you. And when you're struggling, like, I'll pull out that list and we'll just go through them and see if we can find something that'll work. But it's kind of hard, right? Because oftentimes their behaviors can seem less than great when they're struggling. And of course they have an impact in your life. So I would recommend helping them in those ways, but also knowing when you may just need to step out and take care of your needs too. There's a bit of a balancing act that can come from that. Because if you're feeling overwhelmed, or if you're feeling frustrated with them because they're really struggling and it's hard to interact with them, to take care of yourself first, get your needs met, and then try to be a support. And find ways to set those limits, right? Say, you know what, right now I'm in a place where I can't really manage that. I'm having a hard time. Please give me, 30 minutes or so to get myself collected, and then I'll be good. Just to attach to that, we know that it's, with our own ability to manage stress, it's about 100 beats per minute for our bodies. When we get to 100 beats per minute with our heart rate, that's when our bodies start producing hormones that trigger that sympathetic nervous system response, or fight, flight, freeze. So if they're up at 100 beats or more per minute, and they're in fight, flight, freeze mode, and you're getting escalated into that, your mind is just not set up to problem solve when you're in that escalated state. So I would say being able to make it okay and have a space to say, we need to first calm down before we can talk about this, or before I can support you, that would be really important as well. And the best way to do that is,
Go stick their head in ice water.
you could just bring a bowl of ice water and be like, okay, let's take turns. No, distraction, and not avoidance, right? I don't want this to be avoidance, but distraction. And the trick is distracting yourself enough to where you're not thinking about what's stressing you out. So if there's something about the situation that's really stressful, you want to distract yourself, and it's got to be enough that you're not thinking about it. And it's usually at least 30 minutes of not thinking about what's stressing you before our bodies go back to a more regulated state. If you're going and watching a movie or reading a book, but you're just sitting there being like, oh, I'm so mad, you're going to keep your heart rate up. So it's really important to distract yourself, and sometimes, depending on the level of distress of the situation, it could be upwards to an hour before your body goes back to your regulated state. So just keep that in mind too.
Okay, thank you.
For anybody that is trying to resolve conflict and stuff. But yeah, I would just try to have an honest conversation about what support looks like for them, but know your limits as well, and not feel like you have to constantly be the one to resolve their anxiety. And know too that your immediate family members have access to a therapist as well with Blomquist Hale. They can schedule with us.
Even if they're out of the home? So our adult children?
Yes.
So our immediate family?
Really? Our adult children that don't live with us have access to
Yeah.
your,
I'm pretty sure. Because I've worked with adult children before. And I never felt like I had to ask, are they in your home? So I would say, yeah, you can call and check it out, but I've worked with people, adult children,
who would we call?
our main line. To say I have a child, they're an adult, but they could benefit from therapy. I would be shocked if they said no.
Okay.
So will you, with this PowerPoint, will you email it out?
Yeah, I can email that out.
There were a few times I
It's
think-
recorded. It's recorded. It'll be up with the PowerPoint. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I'll just send that.
Okay. Sounds great.
Any other questions? I know we're probably running out of time here, but. Okay, well, thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.